are on chapter 14, verse 55, getting down toward the end here. And I'm going to read verse 55 through 59. Now the chief priest and all the council sought testimony against Jesus to put him to death, but found none. For many bore false witness against him, but their testimonies did not agree. Then some rose up and bore false witness against him, saying, "We heard him say, 'I will destroy this temple made with hands, and within 3 days I will build another made without hands.' But not even then did their testimony agree." Kara, you can put up the next slide. Okay, good. Now, the chief priests were determined to find Jesus guilty, even if it meant breaking their own laws. And here you see a table of some of the laws, 8 different laws at least, that they broke. They held the trial at night, which was illegal, and they did that so no one would know what was happening, and they were meeting. Jewish law specified that no trial could be held on the eve of a feast day, and this was the eve of Passover, so that rule was also broken. The meeting was held at the home of the high priest. The meeting should have been held in the temple, not in a private home. And on top of all of that, they invited false witnesses to testify. Now, some of those false witnesses claimed to hear Jesus say he would destroy the temple made with hands and within 3 days make another without hands. Well, there was some truth to what they were saying, but the details of their testimony still didn't agree. Jesus had prophesied against the temple in chapter 11, and he predicted its destruction in chapter 13. But the words he was accused of saying don't appear in any of the Gospels. The closest statement is in John chapter 2, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." But Jesus was talking about his body as the temple of God, not a building. If they destroyed his body, he would raise it up in 3 days. So the Jewish leaders did not bring any specific charges against Jesus because they had no credible evidence or witnesses to support any charges. Jewish law required at least 2 witnesses to agree on a charge, but the witnesses contradicted each other. Jesus was arrested without a clear charge, so the Sanhedrin itself brought charges which was against their own legal procedures instead of relying on independent witnesses. So this trial was rigged from beginning to end. It's what we call, in my country, a kangaroo court. Jesus didn't even have the opportunity to call any witnesses on his behalf. In their eyes, he was guilty before the trial even began. Okay, verses 60 through 65. And the high priest stood up in the midst and asked Jesus, saying, "Do you answer nothing? What is it these men testify against you?" But he kept silent and answered nothing. Again, the high priest asked him, saying to him, "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed?" Jesus said, "I am, and you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven." Then the high priest tore his clothes and said, "What further need do we have of witnesses? You have heard the testimony. What do you think?" And they all condemned him to be deserving of death. Then some began to spit on him and to blindfold him and to beat him and to say to him, "Prophesy." And the officers struck him with the palms of their hands. So when the witnesses couldn't agree on what Jesus said, the high priest got straight to the point. He asked Jesus, "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed?" Now, Jesus had remained silent when questioned about the temple accusations because Those charges were based on false testimony. He refuses to defend himself against lies. He wouldn't dignify the false charges with a response, but when asked if he is the Christ, he speaks the truth openly, even though it will lead to his own condemnation. He will not stay silent when the truth is spoken. And so he answers clearly, I am. Now, I am is what God called himself when Moses asked his name in Exodus 3. So he's not just claiming to be the Christ, but he's taking God's name, his personal name, for himself. And then Jesus quoted from Daniel 7, and he tells Caiaphas that he will see the fulfillment of Daniel 7. And that comes true when Jesus is resurrected and ascends into heaven. When Caiaphas questioned Jesus, he used the phrase Son of the Blessed instead of saying Son of God. Jews avoided speaking God's name directly out of reverence for him. So he substituted the word blessed for God. Well, Jesus did the same thing. He responded, you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven. Right hand of power is another respectful way of referring to the right hand of God. But Jesus wasn't just being polite. He was making a statement by placing himself at God's right hand and referencing the Son of Man from Daniel 7. He was claiming to be God. It was unmistakable. And this claim was shocking to the religious leaders. They believed Jesus was making himself equal with God, which was blasphemy. And that's why Caiaphas tore his clothes and declared that Jesus had spoken blasphemy. The high priest wasn't allowed to tear his clothing. It was considered an emotional outburst that could influence the vote. When they heard those words, there could only be one punishment, and that was death. There was no need for witnesses anymore. They convicted Jesus with his own words, not with false testimony. And they said he deserved death for telling the truth about who he was. The Sanhedrin could not legally carry out the death penalty for Jesus under Roman rule. They could declare someone guilty and sentence them to death according to Jewish law, but they did not have the authority to execute the sentence themselves. Only the Roman governor had the legal power to carry out the death penalty. And that's why Jesus was brought to Pontius Pilate. He was the Roman governor, and they needed his approval before the death sentence could be carried out. Verse 64 says, they all condemned him to be deserving of death, which means the vote was unanimous. That doesn't mean every member of the Sanhedrin was present or agreed. Some members, such as Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus, were either absent or not invited, or maybe they were there but choose to boycott and not vote. It refers only to those who really were in attendance, all of whom condemned Jesus. And after they condemned him, they didn't just stop there. They started mocking and beating him. They spit on him and even blindfolded him. The blindfold was just another way to humiliate him. They turned it into a game. If you're the Messiah and a prophet, tell us who hit you. Now, some people wonder if Christians invented the story of Jesus' crucifixion. And it's actually a good question to ask. Crucifixion was the most brutal and shameful way to die in the Roman world. If early Christians wanted an irresistible leader for people to follow, why make up a story about someone executed in that horrible manner? Instead, they boldly proclaimed that Jesus died on a cross and rose again, even when that message made them look foolish and brought persecution. Historians say that Jesus was a real person and was crucified under Pontius Pilate. Even one agnostic scholar says one of the most certain facts of history is that Jesus was crucified on orders of the Roman governor of Judea, Pontius Pilate. So what does that tell us? For early believers, the cross wasn't some type of marketing tool to attract followers. It was a stumbling block. They literally turned history upside down, preaching about an executed Messiah because they honestly believed it was true. Mark's gospel was partly written to answer the high priest's question, "Are you the Christ?" It shows that even the cross, as disgraceful as it is part of the real story. No one made this up, and the disciples, every single one of them, really went on to be martyred, except for John. Verses 66 through 72. Now, as Peter was below in the courtyard, one of the servant girls of the high priest came. And when she saw Peter warming himself, she looked at him and said, "You also were with Jesus of Nazareth." But he denied it, saying, "I neither know nor understand what you're saying." And he went out on the porch, and a rooster crowed. And the servant girl saw him again and began to say to those who stood by, "This is one of them." But he denied it again. And a little later, those who stood by said to Peter again, "Surely you are one of them, for you're a Galilean, and your speech shows it." Then he began to curse and swear, "I do not know this man whom you speak." A second time the rooster crowed. Then Peter called to mind the word that Jesus had said to him, "Before the rooster crows twice, you will deny me 3 times." And when he thought about it, he wept. Now, as Jesus is facing mockery as a false prophet, his prediction about Peter's denial is unfolding and proving he is indeed a true prophet of God. Peter is sitting by a fire in the courtyard, trying to stay warm, and a servant girl notices him and says, "You were with Jesus of Nazareth." Well, it turns out the servant girl was a relative of the high priest's servant whose ear Peter cut off. John tells us that. Peter's kind of startled, maybe a little bit fearful here, and he replies, "I don't know what you're talking about." And this is his first denial. Once the servant girl identifies Peter, he moves closer to the porch. This is where you enter and leave the courtyard. He wanted to be able to make a quick escape. And as he moves closer to the porch, he moves further away from Jesus. The first crowing of the rooster follows after that. Now, Peter's first denial does not put off this servant girl. She's determined. In verse 69, she says, "You are one of them." She knew Peter had been with Jesus. People know us by who we associate with. At that moment, Peter wanted to be one of the crowd, not a follower of Jesus. He denied what she said a second time. A little later, someone says to Peter that he must be one of them because he talks like a Galilean. He has an accent. Now Peter is angry. He curses and swears, and he uses words he probably hasn't used since he left the fishing business. "I don't know the man you're talking about," he says. But if that's true, then why was Peter even there? Notice he refers to Jesus as a man. In chapter 8, he called Jesus the Christ. So this is the third denial. And at that moment, the rooster crowed a second time. And then Peter remembered what Jesus had said and wept because it was true. Now, Peter had to tell this story to Mark, and he told it in a certain way, comparing himself with Jesus. Jesus faced the highest Jewish authority in a formal trial, while Peter crumbled under questioning from lowly servants. Jesus was condemned for speaking the truth about himself with his own words. Peter condemned himself with his own words of denial. Peter's denial fulfilled Jesus' prophetic words exactly as he predicted, while Jesus was mocked as a false prophet. So Peter shows us that salvation does not come through human loyalty, which fails, but through Jesus' faithful sacrifice. Even the most committed follower cannot save himself. You can show the next slide here, Cara. Okay, learning from Peter's journey. Peter had a rough week. In just 48 hours' time, he had failed 8 times. On Tuesday night, the disciples protested about the woman who poured expensive perfume on Jesus. And since the word disciples is used, the protest involved all of them, including Peter. His second mistake was on Thursday evening, when Jesus washed the feet of the disciples. At first, Peter protested and said he would never let the Lord wash his feet. He didn't understand the importance of what Jesus was doing. Peter's third failure happened that same evening. He showed that he was unsure about his own dedication to Jesus by asking, along with the other disciples, if he was the one who would betray Jesus. Peter knew that he had the potential to turn against Jesus. But a few hours later, Peter found his courage. At the Last Supper, he had asked, "Is it I?" Then he became more determined, declaring he would never fall away, even if everyone else did. This was his fourth mistake. Peter's fifth mistake was falling asleep when Jesus asked him to pray in Gethsemane. Number 6 was a moment of impulsive zeal when he pulled out his sword and cut off the ear of the high priest's servant. And number 7 was deserting Jesus when he was arrested. Despite his earlier boldness, he fled when the pressure increased. And lastly, Peter denied Jesus 3 times. Now, Luke tells us that after denying Jesus, Peter noticed Jesus turned and looked at him. And it was not a look of disappointment, but of compassion. It pierced Peter's heart, drawing him toward repentance. The Bible openly shows Peter's failures, which gives us hope. Despite his mistakes, the Lord loved him and forgave him. Maybe the most important thing is that Peter didn't vanish after denying Jesus. Instead, he became a bold, spirit-filled leader. His failure transformed him into a pillar of the early church. Okay, let me stop there for a second and ask if there's any questions at this point. Any questions at all? Okay, let's go on to chapter 15, 1 through 5. Immediately in the morning, the chief priest held a consultation with the elders and scribes and the whole council, and they bound Jesus, led him away, and delivered him to Pilate. Then Pilate asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" He answered and said to him, "It is as you say." And the chief priest accused him of many things, but he answered nothing. Then Pilate asked him again, saying, "Do you answer nothing? See how many things they testify against you?" But Jesus still answered nothing, so that Pilate marveled. And you can put up the next slide there, Cara. So that's a timeline of the last 18 hours of Jesus' life, approximately showing when things happened there. The problem for the Sanhedrin was that Pilate wouldn't care about a charge of blasphemy. That's what they had convicted Jesus on, but he would take a charge of rebellion seriously. If people thought Jesus claimed to be king of the Jews, then it became a political issue, and it was challenging Roman authority. Pilate would have to consider that carefully. So the Sanhedrin changed the accusation from blasphemy to rebellion. Pilate started his day at dawn, so Jesus was bound and brought to him for trial sometime between probably 6 or 7 a.m. at the latest. Now, you might wonder, wasn't Stephen also accused of blasphemy and stoned to death by the Jewish leaders? Why wasn't Roman permission needed for that? Well, great question. Glad you asked. Stephen's death was a spontaneous mob action more than a legal execution. The Sanhedrin acted out of anger rather than following proper legal procedures. The Romans ignored this incident because it didn't threaten their authority. Stephen was not claiming to be a king or the Messiah. He didn't have a great following or anything like that. So the Romans kind of looked the other way in his case. If the Jewish leaders had tried to execute Jesus, it could have sparked a riot because he was very popular with the people. The Romans would have needed to step in to keep order. With Jesus, the Jewish leaders preferred crucifixion since it was more painful and humiliating to die that way. That way, they could blame the Romans for his death, and it would also serve as a public warning to his followers. Now, Pilate asked Jesus if he was the king of the Jews, and Jesus replies, "It is as you say." Now, Pilate's question is phrased so that it can be read as either a statement or a question. So the best translation is, "You are king of the Jews?" As though he's just wants confirmation. Everybody tells me you are. So that's kind of how he's asking it. And so Jesus says, "You have said so," which is really an ambiguous answer. This response doesn't confirm or deny the charge in a way that would make Jesus guilty of political rebellion against Rome. He was the Messiah and king, but not in a political or military sense, and that would threaten Roman authority. Pilate did not interrupt Jesus' answer or did not interpret Jesus' answer as evidence that Jesus was a threat to Rome. If Pilate had thought that, he would have arrested the disciples and any other follower of Jesus. So the chief priests are starting to get a little bit nervous. What if he releases Jesus? They've been plotting his death for some time now. So they accused Jesus of many things. These were false accusations, and Mark doesn't specify what they were because they were all lies. They weren't worthy of repeating. Jesus refused to respond to lies, and he only reacted to the truth. Pilate is surprised that he says nothing. He has sentenced many others to death, and they would beg for their lives. But Jesus remained calm and refused to defend himself. Pilate found himself stuck in a courtroom drama, and not by choice. He tried to avoid everything he could in judging Jesus, but the responsibility was his. The same is true for us. At some point, we all face the question, What will I do with Jesus? Jesus told Pilate, you only have power over me by a higher authority. And that tells us that no human is the final authority in our lives. God is. And just as Pilate had to choose what to do with Jesus, we must also make that decision every day for ourselves. Was Jesus telling the truth when he said he was a king? Well, sometimes God places us in situations where we must make a judgment about Jesus. And like Pilate, we must decide whether we agree with what Jesus is doing. Do we free him so he can do what he wants, or send him away? Pilate said, I find no fault in him. He knew what the right thing to do was, but because of outside pressure, he couldn't do the right thing. Okay, verses 6 through 10. Now, at the feast, he was accustomed to releasing one prisoner to them, whomever they requested. And there was one named Barabbas, who was chained with his fellow rebels. They had committed murder in the rebellion. Then the multitude, crying aloud, began to ask him to do just as he had always done for them. But Pilate answered them, saying, do you want me to release to you the king of the Jews? For he knew that the chief priest had handed him over because of envy. So Pilate had a tradition during Passover to release one prisoner chosen by the people. This was an act of goodwill on his part to pacify the crowd. In this case, Pilate found himself in a politically delicate situation. He wanted to avoid executing an innocent man. This custom could be a way to resolve the issue without directly opposing the religious authorities or risking unrest. There had been a small uprising of Jews against Rome before Jesus entered Jerusalem. It wasn't a full-scale revolt, but a few people were killed. Barabbas and others were arrested, and they were awaiting execution. The crowd asked Pilate to do what he usually did and release a prisoner. Pilate offered the crowd a choice, Jesus or Barabbas. He hoped they would choose Jesus because he was less dangerous to Roman rule than Barabbas. Pilate asked, would you like me to release the king of the Jews? Notice that Pilate doesn't say, would you like me to release Jesus? He doesn't believe Jesus is the king of the Jews, but he uses that title to test the crowd's reaction in releasing someone accused of being their king. Pilate knows the chief priest delivered Jesus to him out of envy, not because he was a real threat. The religious leaders felt threatened because Jesus was more popular and well-liked than they were. Barabbas had his own idea of what God's kingdom should look like. He believed in using force to fight against Rome. Even today, Christians living under oppressive governments or facing persecution might feel tempted to think the same way. We all have our own version of God's kingdom that we wish would take control. But responding to violence with more violence, even if we think it's for a holy cause, usually doesn't lead to peace. Jesus was standing there, bloody and beaten, seemingly helpless to do anything. When we feel depressed, it's like Jesus has been beaten and tied up. All our excitement fades away. Jesus doesn't seem so perfect anymore, but there's strength in choosing the cross. Suffering can be overcome, situations can change, and God's grace is enough. The story of Jesus is God's love doing for us what we couldn't do ourselves. The next time we see a crowd in Jerusalem is 50 days later in Acts 2. The power of the cross was already beginning to influence the crowd. Peter told them, with the help of wicked men, you put Jesus to death by nailing him to the cross. The crowd was so shocked that they asked, what shall we do? And Peter told them to repent, be baptized, and receive the Holy Spirit. And 3,000 did. The chief priests no longer had the power to intimidate or manipulate them. On the day of Pentecost, the crowd made the right choice. Verses 11 through 14. But the chief priests stirred up the crowd so that he should rather release Barabbas to them. Pilate answered and said to them again, what then do you want me to do with him whom you call the King of the Jews? So they cried out, crucify him. Then Pilate said to them, why? What evil has he done? And they cried out all the more, crucify him. The name Barabbas means son of the Father. Pilate offers the crowd a choice between Barabbas, the fake son of the Father, or Jesus, the true son of the Father. It's not just about releasing a prisoner. It's a symbolic choice between two kinds of sons. One is violent and rebellious, and the other is innocent and submissive. Jesus becomes the scapegoat. On the Day of Atonement in Leviticus, one goat is sacrificed, atoning for sin, and another is released into the wilderness. Jesus is the sacrificial lamb, and Barabbas is set free. Just like Barabbas, we are all guilty of rebellion, but Jesus offers forgiveness by dying in our place so that we can go free too. The chief priest wanted Jesus out of the way because he threatened their power. Pilate realizes that, so he's trying to do the opposite of what the chief priests want. He wants them to know that he is not their puppet, but the chief priests stir up the crowd. Sometimes you hear it said that the same people who cried Hosanna on Palm Sunday also cried crucify him on Good Friday, but that's really not true. The Palm Sunday crowd came from Galilee with Jesus. The crowd that wanted him crucified mainly was from Jerusalem. They were supporters of the chief priest. And in the early morning, few people in Jerusalem knew what was happening. The crowd did not randomly come together. They were influenced by the chief priests to demand the release of Barabbas instead of Jesus. So they start shouting, we want Barabbas, we want Barabbas. And Pilate asked, what should I do with this man you call the King of the Jews? Now, this is the question we all face. What do we do with Jesus? Pilate inquires what wrong he has done, but they don't answer. Pilate doesn't even know what crime to charge him with. And the crowd keeps shouting, crucify him. Pilate faced the choice between doing what was right, freeing an innocent man, or what was politically convenient, executing an innocent man for treason. He avoids responsibility by letting the crowd decide. The crowd demands death by crucifixion. They show no mercy for Jesus, not even a lighter sentence. Crucifixion was reserved for anti-Roman rebels like Barabbas. Now, Mark presents us with two very different types of saviors, each with their own way of establishing God's kingdom on earth. First, there's Jesus. He was a prophet who spoke out against injustice, healed people, and challenged the leaders, but he never used violence. He didn't view the people of the world as enemies. Instead, he pointed to the religious leaders, the chief priests, elders, and scribes, as opposing God's way. Then there's Barabbas. He was involved in a violent uprising against the Romans and had committed murder during that rebellion. He was a man of violence who believed in using physical force and violence to achieve his political goals. The end justified the means. Mark was writing when the church in Rome was being persecuted, and they might have been tempted to follow Barabbas's example. Today, some people might be tempted to use force or violence to overthrow an unjust government. We prefer quick, forceful solutions rather than the more difficult work of genuine transformation. And this leads us to an important question. Is it right to use violence to oppose unjust governments? What Mark is saying is that either path, the way of Jesus or the way of Barabbas, can lead to death. When given the choice between Jesus and Barabbas, the crowd's selection of Barabbas is shown as a tragic mistake. Jesus' way is better because his approach offers spiritual freedom, not just political freedom. His way of peace, forgiveness, and loving enemies reflects God's character. Jesus told his followers to reject violence and instead love their enemies. The early church continued this tradition, often enduring suffering rather than fighting back against oppression. If you're wondering what that photo is there, that is actually a nail that has been hammered through a heel bone of a person. And so that is part of the proof that we know that crucifixion did take place. Okay, verses 15 through 20. So Pilate, wanting to gratify the crowd, released Barabbas to them, and he delivered Jesus after he had scourged him to be crucified. Then the soldiers led him away into the hall called Praetorium, and they called together the whole garrison. And they clothed him with purple, and they twisted a crown of thorns, and put it on his head, and began to salute him, "Hail, King of the Jews." And then verse 18 here, verse 19, then they struck him on the head with a reed and spat on him, and bowing the knee, they worshipped him. And when they had mocked him, they took the purple off him, put his clothes on him, and led him out to crucify him. Okay. Now it says Pilate wanted to please the crowd, not the chief priest. He felt no obligation to hold a fair trial. Pilate wanted to prevent riots and get through the Passover without any significant issues. He never accused Jesus of a specific crime, nor did he ever deliver a verdict. He handed down the death sentence without finding Jesus guilty. Pilate released Barabbas and handed Jesus over to be scourged. Barabbas became a symbol of freedom. He represented what many longed for, a forceful overthrow of Roman rule. When we don't see God's plans clearly, it's tempting to cheer for a strong man, someone like Barabbas, who seems to offer a quick fix, rather than Jesus, whose path of humble love often looks quiet and risky. But that kind of hope is misplaced. As Proverbs 14:12 reminds us, there is a way that seems right to a man, but in the end it leads to death. Pilate released Barabbas and handed Jesus over to be scourged. Barabbas became the symbol of freedom there. He had tried to do what many people wanted Jesus to do, overthrow the Roman government. And when we don't understand what God is doing, we may be tempted to look at people like Barabbas did. Now, before someone was crucified, they would be scourged with a whip. The Bible doesn't tell us how many times Jesus was whipped before he was crucified, but we know he was beaten very severely. In Jewish law, the maximum sentence received would be 40 lashes, but they usually stopped at 39 lashes just to be safe. But Jewish leaders did not scourge Jesus. Roman soldiers did. And the Romans had no limit. They could strike someone as many times as they wanted. And the Roman whip was very painful with sharp pieces of metal or bone in it. When they struck Jesus, it would have cut deep into his skin and caused heavy bleeding. Sometimes people even died from the scourging alone. Even though we don't know the exact number of lashes Jesus received, we know it was many, and he suffered greatly before he even reached the cross. After Jesus was scourged, the Roman soldiers led him into the praetorium. This once belonged to Herod the Great and later served as Pilate's headquarters in Jerusalem. The soldiers summoned the entire cohort, around 600 men, to turn his suffering into their entertainment. They stripped Jesus of his clothes and covered him in a purple robe, a soldier's cloak. And then they twisted a crown of thorns on his head and handed him a reed as a fake scepter. And then they knelt before him and mockingly exclaimed, "Hail, King of the Jews." Their purpose was to shame and humiliate Jesus. Okay, next slide, Cara. Yes, go back one. Back one, Cara. Yes, right there. Okay. Now, Mark's gospel doesn't just end with a tragic death. It's written like a grand Roman victory parade. Whenever the Romans won a battle in Rome, they would have this victory march throughout the city, and certain things would take place. And scholars have noticed that the events of Jesus' crucifixion follow the pattern of a Roman victory march that celebrates the victorious general with honor and glory. So Mark turns what was meant to humiliate Jesus into a scene of victory, showing us that his suffering is actually the moment of his greatest triumph. During a Roman victory celebration, soldiers would gather early in the morning to honor their hero. He was then crowned and dressed in royal garments. People held him as king, and he would march through the city with his followers. A sacrifice was carried along the route, and it was offered at the end of the march as the final sacrifice. The hero was offered wine, but declined, after which he was exalted and called king. Two others stood next to him, and finally, a Roman soldier proclaimed him the Son of God. Now, Mark's readers in Rome would have recognized this pattern. They had seen these parades with their own eyes. Jesus doesn't win by killing his enemies, but by giving up his life. His shame becomes his glory. His weakness becomes his strength. His death isn't a defeat, it's a royal victory. Jesus was crowned right there on the cross, not later in heaven. In God's upside-down kingdom, the cross isn't the end, it's the throne. What looked like weakness was actually the most powerful act in history. Jesus didn't die because of political schemes. He died because it was the will of God. And in that obedience, the real victory was won. Okay, verses 21 through 24. Then they compelled a certain man, Simon a Cyrenian, the father of Alexander and Rufus, as he was coming out of the country and passing by, to bear his cross. And they brought him to the place Golgotha, which is translated place of a skull. And then they gave him wine mingled with myrrh to drink, but he did not take it. And when they crucified him, they divided his garments, casting lots for them to determine what every man should take. Jesus was so weak from the scourging that he couldn't carry the crossbeam. This would have been the perfect opportunity for one of the disciples to step forward and take the cross for him. But they had all disappeared. John is the only one we know for sure who saw Jesus crucified. Simon of Cyrene in North Africa was visiting Jerusalem for the Passover. He was a stranger in town. He had never heard of Jesus, and he didn't even know what was happening that day. He just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, or maybe later he would say he was in the right place at the right time. The soldiers saw that he looked strong, and they ordered him to carry the cross. And Mark provides details not found in any other gospel. He says that Simon was the father of Alexander and Rufus. Now, we know Mark was writing to the church in Rome. When Paul wrote his letter to the Romans, he mentioned Rufus, chosen in the Lord, and his mother, who has been a mother to me too. Simon's two sons were so well known that Mark could mention them by name, and they would be recognized. And Paul greets his mother because she was Simon's wife, of the man who carried the cross of Jesus. So something happened to Simon that day when he took up the cross. He became a follower of Jesus, and later his two sons also did. Something happens to each of us when we take up the cross. It changes our lives and those who know us. Jesus said, if any man would follow me, he must take up his cross. The act of carrying the cross became a badge of honor for Simon's family, just as our willingness to bear the cross of Christ can bring honor to those who come after us, to our family. Like Simon, we stand on the sidelines watching an evil and sick world. A voice says, take up your cross and follow me. When we choose to take up the cross, we are changed, and the Alexanders and Rufuses in our lives are blessed as a result. Golgotha is called the place of the skull because that is where people were executed. But it was also a cliff that resembled a skull. And if you look in the photo there, you can see kind of in the middle what could look like two eyes and a nose there. So it was a cliff that resembled a skull. Now, Jesus was offered wine mixed with myrrh, which was meant to lessen the pain of the cross, but he refused. He said in Mark 14:25, I will no longer drink of the fruit of the vine until that day when I drink it new in the kingdom of God. He chose to die clear-headed, able to speak words from the cross, words he would have not been able to say if he had allowed himself to be drugged, which means he wanted us to hear those very words that he spoke on the cross. Mark writes, they crucified him, but he doesn't explain how it was done. Now, back then, everyone understood what crucifixion was. It was a brutal and public punishment used by the Romans. Mark didn't need to describe it. His readers likely had seen it before. Mark wasn't focusing on the pain of the cross, but on the purpose of the cross. He wants us to see who Jesus is and why he died, not just what happened to his body. Mark lets the impact of that moment speak for itself. They divided his clothes among themselves. They were probably bloody and dirty, but they were valuable enough that they cast lots for them. Jesus was left completely naked on the cross. Psalm 22:18 says, "They divide my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots." Now, we're not told the exact number of Roman soldiers at the crucifixion, but it wasn't a big battalion. It was just a handful, maybe 4, under the direction of a centurion. And their mission was to carry out the execution, to secure the site, and then keep the crowd in check. Jesus was abandoned by some of his closest followers and surrounded by mocking soldiers and curious onlookers. A few faithful women stayed till the very end. If Jesus endured that pain, surrounded by enemies and unfamiliar faces, what does that say about his love for us? His love doesn't vanish when we feel alone. Even when we feel completely abandoned, he's right there loving us in our loneliness. Verses 25 through 30. Now it was the 3rd hour, and they crucified him, and the inscription of his accusation was written above, "The King of the Jews." With him they also crucified 2 robbers, one on his right and the other on his left. So the scripture was fulfilled, which says, "And he was numbered with the transgressors. And those who passed by blasphemed him, wagging their heads and saying, 'Aha, you who destroyed the temple and build it in 3 days, save yourself and come down from the cross.'" Mark structures the crucifixion story around specific times. This is kind of like his way of time stamping, documenting what happened. Jesus is on the cross for 6 hours. At the 3rd hour, 9 a.m., he is crucified between 2 robbers. Darkness falls over the land at the 6th hour, 12 noon, and it lasts until the 9th hour, 3 p.m., when Jesus calls out to God and dies. A person was crucified by being nailed to a cross using long, heavy iron spikes, typically about 11 to 18 centimeters long. And these nails were driven through the wrist area, not the palms, because the palms couldn't bear the weight of the body. They would begin to tear apart. And to add to the agony, the victim's arms might have been tied with rope to the crossbeam, ensuring that they could not move. And for the feet, a heavy iron nail was driven through one heel bone, securing that side firmly to the wood. Because the body was suspended in this awkward position, the condemned person would have had to push up with their legs to breathe. And that became impossible over time, leading to a slow, agonizing suffocation. The combination of ropes and nails increased the pain level, making death slow and excruciating, which is how Roman crucifixions were designed to be. The Romans posted a notice above the condemned person's head listing the charge. In Jesus' case, it simply read, "King of the Jews." Other gospels say the charge was written in Hebrew, Greek, and Latin so it wouldn't be missed. Pilate had ordered the notice fastened to the cross. It was meant to mock the chief priest who had pressured him into this decision. What Peter had said in chapter 8 about Jesus being the Christ, what the voice from heaven declared in chapter 9, "This is my beloved Son," what Caiaphas mockingly mentioned in chapter 14, and what the centurion himself announced in verse 39 was true. Jesus is King, not only of the Jews, but of all mankind. 2 others were crucified with Jesus. In the early moments of the crucifixion, these 2 said nothing. Later in the morning, they mocked him, and one of them experienced a change of heart, as Luke tells it. The scripture was fulfilled by Isaiah 53:12, and he was numbered with the transgressors. Now, you've seen movies where it shows Jesus being crucified, and he always seems to be like 5 or maybe 4 or 5 meters higher off the ground. Well, that's really not how it happened. Crucifixions were carried out at eye level, or only slightly elevated rather than high above the crowd. And so those who passed by could look Jesus directly in the eye. You were even allowed to speak to the person, as this crowd did when they insulted and mocked Jesus. You could even throw objects at the person, but touching them was not allowed. The guards were there to keep order and prevent anyone from removing the body without permission. Wagging the head was a common way of ridiculing a foolish or condemned person. It intensified the humiliation Jesus felt and added emotional torment to his physical suffering. Mark uses the word blasphemy in verse 29, and he does this to remind us that Jesus was accused of blasphemy, but he's using it about the scribes, the chief priests. It's as though Mark is saying, let me show you what real blasphemy looks like. The mocking at the cross is more than insults. It completely denies who God is and what he stands for. They have turned a spiritual statement into a joke. It's not just about being disrespectful. Mark presents the crowd as dishonoring God's work itself. But Jesus stood firm through all the scorn. His silence in the face of disrespect shows a different perspective. His heart was full of love, even amid the hatred that was shown him. Okay, I'm going to stop there and ask if there's any questions that anyone has.
Yeah, Mark Edward here. Yes, I did
Yes,
not
Eddie.
know that the crucifixion, that it was not that high up, but rather at eye level. I always, all the while, was under the impression that it was held up high up. So
Well,
that is a
that's what
different.
TV does and movies do. It
Because at
really
eye
it would.
level
Go
is
ahead.
quite dramatic and quite painful or insulting, that people can just
Exactly.
pass by and just with disgust shaking their head. And so the Pharisee that looked into his eye and said, if you are really the Son of God, why don't you get out from the cross and heal yourself? Oh yeah, that is really yeah, it gives a different impression right now.
It does. It does. Because, like, when you see it on movies or TV, it looks like he's got a lot of space between them, and maybe he's not even hearing what they're saying, but he's right there. They're right in his face saying
Wow.
these things, mocking him, which does, as you say, present a whole different perspective about that.
Yeah, it
Thanks for
does.
sharing that.
Yeah, thanks for teaching this topic.
Any other questions? Okay. One thing I have to say, we have one more time to meet, but unfortunately, Debbie and I will be gone next week. We will be in the Philippines. We have some meetings there. So we will meet again on 17 September, and that will be the last time that we meet, 17 September. So everybody got that? And I will let you go and see you in 2 weeks, 2 weeks from tonight. So God bless you all. Have a good sleep. Have a good rest.
Bye. Shalom.
Bless you too. Thank you, Mark.
God bless.
You're welcome all.
Okay, bye. Shalom. I'm driving.
Shalom,
Shalom.
Dr. Bhatt.